I'm Nanette Stahl, and I'm the Mazer Librarian for Judaic Studies at Yale University in the library. And I'm sitting with Professor Eliyahu Stern, who is a member of the Judaic Studies program at Yale, which is part of the Department of Religious Studies. And we're going to discuss today the term Zionism. Professor Stern recently taught a class on Zionism, and I recently put together a study guide, which is online, on this term. And I thought it might be helpful for students at Yale to hear Professor Stern discuss the subject perhaps more thoroughly as an introduction to students who wish to pursue studies on the subject of Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel and the renewal of the Hebrew language. So I'm going to turn to Professor Stern and begin our discussion. So thank you, first of all, for coming and sitting with us and being willing to discuss your class on Zionism and your thoughts about the subject.
Thanks for inviting me.
It's my pleasure. And what I'd like to start with is if you would be willing to simply define the term Zionism. How are we to understand this term? And has its meaning changed over time from the beginning, maybe even predating Theodore Herzl, starting with the Chovevei Zion movement in Eastern Europe, to Theodore Herzl and moving forward? How would you define this term Zionism? What does it mean to you?
Well, like every important term in human history, Zionism is no less contested than democracy, republicanism, or any other major political term that has captured millions of people and has been the basis for large-scale social and political mobilization. So Zionism, in terms of its the ideas behind it, can roughly be broken up into just two simple definitions. You can, of course, say there's upwards of 10, 20, 30, but for our purposes, I think there are two simple definitions of the term. The term emerges, not so much the term, but the idea itself of Zionism emerges in the last third of the 19th century. And it's an idea that is based upon seeing Jews first and foremost as a nationality, as a defined group. And then the question becomes of once one sees Jews as a defined national cultural entity, not just a religious entity, but as a cultural or national entity, not just seeing Judaism as a religion, but seeing it as a civilization, as a people, as a culture, as a nation. Seeing it in those terms, the question becomes then, what becomes or what should be with that group? And Zionism will split at least into two main factions. One which will focus upon a certain cultural rejuvenation of the Jewish people. And the other will see that term much more in terms of the attempt to create a Jewish state. One will be focused upon the transformation of Judaism into a secular worldview that can speak to the challenges of modern Western life. And the other group, or another group, will see it as primarily an idea to protect Jews from the threats of anti-Semitism, on both, certainly both groups, both those that saw Zionism as a cultural movement to produce new expressions of Jewish art, new expressions of Jewish music, new expressions of Jewish knowledge that take as their bedrock the idea of Jews, seeing Jews as a people, or in civilizational terms. Certainly that group has been incredibly successful. We have now, in the last 100 years, an incredible body of Hebrew literature right? That produced already a Nobel Prize winner, and a kind of literary products that can compete on a world stage, which is a very serious cultural feat. In the realm of Jewish music, in the realm of Jewish ideas, there's certainly been an incredible transformation in terms of a secularization of those core cultural components that have taken place since Zionism emerged. On the state level, Zionism was very successful. It was somehow able to take a national entity that was based materially in Europe, actually Eastern, and take all those groups of people and shift them over to the Middle East and create a state. Now, that's also, which has become known as the State of Israel today. Now, that state was born in conflict with another group of people that also had claims to that land, that were also on that land. And that continues to be a contested legacy. It continues to be a source of great anxiety for many Jews and for Western life, for that matter. So Zionism still remains a project that on some level has been fulfilled. There is a state. That state, however, is in many ways contested, challenged, even though it is a force in Western life. Its GDP and its economy are booming, but in many ways is still left unsettled in terms of its relationship to the broader Middle East and specifically to the Palestinians, which has created many critics of what's come to be understood as a Zionist project.
Who would you think of as being the giants of this movement? I mean, if major personalities that you would point to who helped make this movement a success and move it forward?
Well, again, there's, I would point to, of course, one being which many know, Theodor Herzl becomes really the founder of the idea of a Jewish state. But Herzl's ideas themselves, right? The idea of having a Jewish state, which he was not necessarily wedded to the idea of Israel being that state. Famously promoted the Uganda project. The Jews would all go to Uganda. But there were those also like Pinsker, and there were others who, along with him, established that model of a Jewish state being the definition of Zionism, a place in which Jews could be protected. So I think in terms of those could be sovereign, well, sovereign and protected from the threats of anti-Semitism. Sovereignty carries a lot of other qualities to it, yes, which would be further developed by a whole range of various political thinkers. But I think for Herzl, it was first and foremost a way of solving the Jewish problem in Europe, in which Jews were constantly being scapegoated in Europe for various social and economic problems plaguing various Western European and Eastern European states. Herzl wanted to solve that Jewish problem in Europe by creating a state of Israel, taking out this scapegoat from European politics and giving them their own state. On the other side, in terms of cultural, what we call cultural Zionism, seeing Zionism as a project that would transform the internal dynamics of Jewish life, not necessarily focused on the external threats. One would have to say someone like Usher Ginsburg or Ahad Ha'am, an Odessa-based essayist who famously sought to use Zionism or see in Zionism a space of cultural rejuvenation of the Jewish people. So when you would open up my class, for example, you would open up Arthur Hertzberg's Reader, which is kind of the classic English reader on Zionism. His first essay, his introduction, really deals with these two different world views, these two different philosophies of Zionism, one of them, of course, being Herzl's status-based definition of the term, and Ahad Ha'am's cultural-based understanding of Zionism.
Of course, Ahad Ha'am ended up in Palestine, and unfortunately Theodore Herzl his life was cut short so young and never made it. I mean, he visited
Palestine. And he got his burial. He got his burial.
And he's buried there, but his remains were brought there.
Right.
Any other people of importance, do you think, beyond these two?
Certainly in my own work and in the class I teach, I try to emphasize figures like Aaron Shmuel Lieberman and Moses Lilienblum, who were originally, in some sense, socialists. They first came out of the 1870s adopting materialist readings of Jewish life, seeing Jews in Eastern Europe as having their own economic, political, linguistic, cultural identity markers. And out of that materialist worldview, there then developed, over that, a kind of, at least in Lilienblum's case, a kind of Zionist ideology. And Lilienblum would end up, of course, being the founder, one of the founders of the Chibat Zion movement, the Lovers of Zionism movement, which predated Herzl by by 20 years and was responsible for the first immigration to Palestine beginning in 1881. Yes, and Biluim, Beit Yaakov L'chu V'Nelcha, the children of Jacob who would go forth. That was the young wing of the Chibat Zion movement, the Lovers of Zion movement, that would be responsible for the first settlements in Palestine. And to some degree that those groups were also comprised of those, many of whom who were not observant, not religious. Jews have been coming to Palestine for thousands of years. They have been coming. But the idea of secular Jews coming to Palestine, that was something that emerged after the 1880s.
Do you see Zionism as essentially a secular movement? Is there room for religious Zionists? In other words, you're religious, you automatically in some ways a Zionist, because every prayer mentions Jerusalem, every the return to Zion, the rebuilding of the temple, and so on and so forth. So is Zionism something you're part, or is this mainly a secular movement? And if you are observant, can you be part of the Zionist movement?
That's a very complicated issue, and that's why one of the big issues I spend a semester on in my class. On a simple, to put it simply, I think, Zionism was born out of a secular impulse. That was its first architects, those such as Lilienblum and Pinsker and Herzl, assumed that politics had to be secular. And by secular, they didn't mean that it was devoid of Jewish sources. It's very important. Very important. It doesn't mean devoid of Jewish sources. Much in the same way, any political, much in the same way, America did not believe it was per se devoid of any religious sources. That there weren't religious ideas that were behind or that were present in the founders' thinking. But that, and here's the most important point for this group, they were not wedded to any kind of traditional reading of Judaism. Their understanding of Zionism would not have to conform to the boundaries set by the rabbinic tradition. They were not interested whether or not the rabbinic tradition approved or disapproved of their actions. They felt free to choose from rabbinic, Kabbalistic, biblical sources to the extent that it helped them create and establish a secular political movement. Now there were, of course, those that challenged that. There were people like Samuel Molliver, who certainly was a religious figure and deeply believed that these ideas came out of religious sources. But one has to remember that the original religious Zionists, the Mizrahi Party, also voted for Uganda. People forget this. They were Herzl's chief supporters, because their assumption was that that the threat of anti-Semitism or the protection and flourishing of Jews politically was not to be mixed with the flourishing of Jews spiritually. They were two distinct issues. Jews' spiritual life could continue to exist theoretically in the diaspora, provided actually the very first, the strongest, staunchest supporters actually of Herzl was the Mizrahi movement, was originally the religious Zionist movement. So while there have always been religious Zionists, it's important to note that the first religious Zionists were actually, their Zionism was secular.
In a sense that it wasn't focused on the land of Israel. Could be
That's
anywhere.
correct. Could be anywhere. That's right. That's right.
That's very interesting.
And that's one of the real points in my class that I try to get at is what is the relationship between religion and politics? And what is the relationship between Zionism and a secular Jewish identity? Is that possible? What do we mean by the word secular? What do we mean by the word religious? Is religious something biblical? Is it something based upon the Talmud or rabbinic? Is it based on the Kabbalah? Is it something spiritual? So the questions of religion and nationality are always heightened, incredibly present in Zionist enterprise, but also have been incredibly theorized to be able to understand what exactly are the differences and what are the similarities between Judaism as a religion and seeing Judaism as something national or cultural.
Well, these are issues we could go on talking about for a long time, and this is probably a question that still is relevant today as it was at the beginning of the 20th century. So we're not going to solve all of these answers now, but it is good to bring them up, and I hope that students listening to this conversation will have ideas bubble up in their heads that they can then bring to their studies on the subject, and perhaps to papers, and maybe even more than that. So thank you so much for coming and speaking to us about this. And I hope that a lot of people will have a chance to listen to it and get something from it. Thank you.
Sounds good. Have a good day.
You too. That's it.